Get out of my car. The words cut through the quiet like a slammed door, sharp and final, hanging in the cold air as rain began to tap against the windshield in uneven rhythms. Marcus Reed didn't argue. He didn't even blink. His hand rested for a moment on the leather seat, steady, grounded, before he reached for the handle and stepped out into the storm. The door shut with a hollow thud behind him, sealing off the warmth, the silence, the world he had occupied for the past 3 years. Inside the car, Edward Callahan exhaled, long and impatient, fingers tightening around the steering wheel as if reclaiming control over something that had briefly slipped. Unbelievable, he muttered under his breath, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror where Marcus's figure was already fading into the gray blur of rain and streetlights. The city stretched ahead in slick reflections, neon lights bending across wet asphalt, the kind of night where everything felt distant, detached, manageable. Edward adjusted his cuff, the crisp fabric brushing against his wrist, grounding him in the familiar rhythm of precision and order. He didn't notice the first sound at first. It was subtle, a faint, irregular beep, almost swallowed by the hum of the engine and the rain tapping against the roof. He shifted slightly, irritation lingering in his chest, replaying the moment in his mind. The driver speaking out of turn, the quiet insistence in his voice, the way Marcus had hesitated, as if weighing something more than just words. Edward shook it off. People like him didn't get to hesitate. They followed instructions. They stayed invisible. Another beep, louder this time, off rhythm. His hand paused mid-motion, hovering above the steering wheel. The dashboard lights flickered faintly, reflecting in his eyes, sharp and clinical. He swallowed, the dryness in his throat catching him off guard. His chest felt tight. Not pain. Not exactly. Just pressure. Like something closing in from the inside, slow and deliberate. He shifted in his seat, adjusting, as if posture alone could correct it. The rain grew heavier, drumming harder now, filling the silence that had begun to stretch too thin. His fingers tapped once against the wheel. Then again, the sound inside the car changed. The beeping, once distant, now clearer. Irregular. Unsettling. His breath shortened, barely noticeable at first, then sharper, pulling in air that didn't seem to go deep enough. No, he whispered, almost to himself, the words slipping out before he could stop it. Outside, the streetlights blurred into streaks of gold and white, distorted through water and glass. He reached toward the console, his movements slower now, less precise. The device indicator pulsed faintly, a signal he recognized, a signal he had been told to monitor. But not like this, never like this. His jaw tightened. Somewhere, beneath the rising tension, a memory surfaced. A calm voice, measured, certain. Marcus's voice. Sir, you might want to check that. Edward's grip faltered. The steering wheel slipped slightly beneath his palm. His vision narrowed, edges dimming as the sound inside the car grew louder, more urgent, echoing against the confined space. The rain outside softened for a brief moment, as if the world itself had paused. And on the empty sidewalk behind him, Marcus Reed stopped walking. Marcus Reed stood still under the rain, water running down the back of his neck, soaking through the thin fabric of his shirt. But his eyes were not on the street ahead anymore. They were fixed on the car he had just left behind, the faint glow of its brake lights cutting through the gray like a warning that refused to fade. And then he heard it. Not clearly, not fully, but enough, that uneven rhythm. The kind of sound that did not belong in a normal engine, the kind of sound he had trained himself never to ignore. His jaw tightened slightly as memory aligned with instinct. 3 years of quiet observation, of noting patterns, of hearing what others dismissed. Edward Callahan was a man who controlled everything, his schedule, his meetings, even his breathing at times. But there were moments, rare and brief, when control slipped. Marcus had seen it in the subtle tightening of his grip, the slight delay before he answered a question, the way his hand would hover near the console, where the concealed medical device rested. Never openly acknowledged, always hidden behind tailored suits and precise routines, Marcus had never asked, never crossed that line, but he had listened, and now that sound, that irregular pulse, it was wrong. Inside the car, Edward's vision flickered again, the world outside compressing into narrow bands of light and shadow, His chest rose sharply as he tried to pull in air that felt just out of reach. His fingers fumbled toward the console, pressing once, then again, the response delayed. Inconsistent, his breath hitched, a quiet frustration turning into something else, something unfamiliar, something he could not command away. Focus, he whispered, the word thin, almost swallowed by the rain. His mind searching for the steps, the protocol, the calm logic that had always guided him. But the sequence felt fragmented, incomplete, like pages missing from a manual he had never expected to need. Outside, Marcus exhaled slowly, the cold air steadying him as he turned halfway back. Not fully committing. Not yet. The street was empty. No pedestrians, no passing headlights. Just the low hum of the city in the distance and the soft, relentless fall of rain. He could walk away. No one would question it. No one would even notice. That was the role he had been given. Invisible, replaceable. But the sound came again, sharper now, cutting through the quiet, and that was enough. Marcus took a step back toward the car, measured, deliberate, his boots pressing into the wet pavement. Each step carrying the weight of a choice he had already made long before this moment. Inside, Edward's hand slipped from the console, falling loosely against his side as his head tilted slightly, his breathing uneven, the device indicator pulsing faintly with a rhythm that no longer aligned with his body, his control, his certainty, all of it narrowing into a single fragile thread, and somewhere, just beyond the glass, through the blur of rain and reflection, a figure moved back toward him. The rain softened for a brief second, as if the city itself was holding its breath, and Marcus Reed reached the driver's side door just as another uneven pulse echoed from inside. Louder now. Urgent. He did not rush. His hand moved with practiced calm as he pulled the door open, the interior light flickering across Edward Callahan's face. Pale under the dim glow, his eyes unfocused, his breathing shallow and irregular. Marcus stepped in halfway, one knee pressing against the wet pavement, the scent of leather and cold air mixing with something else, something clinical, something failing. "Sir, stay with me," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady. Not loud, not commanding, just present, grounding. Edward's lips moved slightly, no clear words forming, just a strained attempt at control that no longer responded. Marcus's eyes shifted to the console, the hidden panel slightly ajar from Edward's earlier attempt, the device indicator blinking in an erratic sequence. Marcus exhaled once, slow, measured, his hands moving without hesitation now, muscle memory taking over where thought would only slow him down. He reached into the compartment, fingers locating the control interface he had only ever observed from a distance, never touched, never acknowledged, until now. Outside, the rain picked up again, tapping harder against the roof, each drop marking time in a rhythm that contrasted sharply with the unstable pulse inside the car. Edward's head tilted further, his hand slipping completely from the wheel, his body no longer holding itself upright with the same rigid precision. Marcus leaned in closer, his voice still calm. "I need you to focus on me. Just breathe. Do not fight it." His tone carried no trace of fear, only clarity, the kind that cut through confusion. His thumb pressed against the interface, adjusting the sequence, pausing, listening, correcting. The beeping shifted, not steady yet, but different, less chaotic, more responsive. Marcus watched closely, reading the subtle changes, the slight lift in Edward's chest, the faint return of rhythm that had nearly disappeared. "That is it," Marcus murmured under his breath, more to the process than to the man, his other hand steadying Edward's shoulder just enough to keep him aligned, not forceful, just supportive. The rain blurred the outside world into streaks of gray and gold, isolating the moment entirely within the car, within the narrow space where control had been lost and was now, slowly, carefully, being restored. Seconds stretched longer than they should have, each one carrying weight, until finally the sound evened out, not perfect, but stable enough to hold. Marcus released a slow breath he had been holding, his shoulders lowering slightly as he watched Edward's chest rise more evenly, the tension easing just enough to signal that the immediate danger had passed. Edward's eyes blinked once, then again, focus returning in fragments, confusion first, then recognition. his gaze settling on Marcus, still half inside the car, rain dripping from his sleeves onto the floor mat, silent, composed, exactly where he had been told not to be. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The only sound now the steady rain and the quieter, controlled rhythm of the device. And in that silence, something shifted. Something that had nothing to do with power or control, and everything to do with the simple, undeniable fact that Marcus Reed had just become the one thing Edward Callahan could not replace. Edward Callahan did not move at first, his eyes fixed on Marcus as if trying to reconcile two completely different versions of the same man. The one he had dismissed minutes ago, and the one now steadying his world with quiet precision. His breath came slower now, deeper, each inhale no longer a struggle, but still fragile, like something that could slip again if he lost focus. The rain outside softened into a steady curtain, muting the city, isolating them inside the car where everything had shifted without warning. Edward swallowed, his throat dry. His voice when it came was low and unsteady. What did you do? The question was not sharp, not demanding. It carried something unfamiliar, something closer to uncertainty. Marcus did not answer immediately. His eyes remained on the device for a moment longer, confirming the rhythm, confirming stability. His fingers hovered briefly before he closed the panel with careful precision, restoring the hidden order Edward had relied on, without ever acknowledging. Only then did Marcus lean back slightly, still half inside the car, rain dripping from his sleeves onto the edge of the seat, his voice calm, even. It was already failing. I just corrected the timing. No pride, no emphasis, just fact. Edward blinked, processing, his mind still catching up to what his body had already experienced. You knew about this, he said, the words slower now, each one deliberate. Marcus met his gaze, steady, unflinching. I noticed patterns, he replied simply. You do not miss something like that if you are paying attention. The statement hung in the air, not accusatory, but undeniable. Edward's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in realization, the kind that settled deeper than reaction. His hand lifted weakly, resting against his chest as if grounding himself in the rhythm that had nearly disappeared. Silence stretched between them, not empty, but heavy with everything that had just happened, everything that had been ignored before this moment. Outside, a car passed in the distance, its headlights briefly cutting through the rain before fading again. A reminder that the world was still moving even as theirs had paused. Edward exhaled slowly, longer this time, his shoulders lowering as tension he had not acknowledged began to release. I fired you, he said finally, the words landing differently now, stripped of authority, carrying weight instead. Marcus did not respond to that, his posture unchanged, neither defensive nor submissive, just present. Edward's gaze dropped briefly to the steering wheel, then back to Marcus, something shifting again, subtle but real. And you came back anyway. There was no accusation in it, only a quiet recognition. Marcus's answer came without hesitation. You needed help, simple, direct, nothing added, nothing taken away. Edward let out a breath that almost resembled a quiet laugh, though it held no humor, only disbelief at the simplicity of it, at the clarity he had overlooked. His world had always been defined by control, by transactions, by power measured in influence and precision, and yet none of that had mattered in the moment his life narrowed down to a single failing rhythm, and the only person who could restore it was the one he had just dismissed. The realization settled in slowly, not as a sudden shock, but as something heavier, something that would not fade once acknowledged. Edward shifted slightly in his seat, testing his stability. The device continued its steady pulse, quieter now, reliable. His eyes returned to Marcus, no longer seeing just a driver, but something far more difficult to categorize, something that did not fit within the structures he had built his life around. And for the first time in a long time, Edward Callahan did not know what to say next. Edward Callahan remained seated, his hands resting loosely on the steering wheel now, not gripping it like before, as if the need to control every inch of the moment had quietly slipped away, replaced by something heavier, something he could not quite name. The steady pulse from the device filled the silence, no longer alarming, but present, constant, a reminder of how close everything had come to unraveling. Marcus Reed shifted slightly, still half inside the car, rainwater pooling near his boots, his posture unchanged, composed, as if what had just happened required no explanation, no recognition, just acceptance. Edward watched him for a long second, studying the details he had ignored for years, the calm in his expression, the absence of urgency, even in a moment that demanded it. "How long have you known?" Edward asked finally, his voice steadier now, but quieter. Stripped of the sharp edge it once carried, Marcus did not look away. "Long enough to recognize when it goes off." "Pattern," he replied, simple, measured. Edward's brow tightened slightly, not in anger, but in thought. "And you never said anything." The words came slower, almost questioning himself as much as Marcus. Marcus exhaled lightly, the sound barely audible over the rain. "It was not my place," he said, and that sentence settled deeper than anything else. Edward leaned back slightly, his head resting against the seat, the weight of that answer pressing against everything he believed about order and hierarchy. His world had always been structured around roles, clear lines, defined limits, and yet those same lines had almost cost him everything. He let out a slow breath, longer than the last, his gaze drifting toward the windshield where the rain blurred the city into soft streaks of light. "You followed every rule," Edward murmured, almost to himself, "even the ones that did not make sense." Marcus did not respond to that directly, his eyes briefly scanning the device again, ensuring stability, then returning to Edward, steady as before. "Rules keep things predictable," he said, "but they do not always keep people safe." The words landed quietly, without force, but they carried weight. Edward's fingers tapped once against the wheel, then stopped, as if even that small habit no longer felt necessary. The silence stretched again, but it was different now, not tense, not uncertain, just present, filled with the aftermath of something neither of them could ignore. Edward straightened slightly in his seat, testing his breath again, steady, controlled, real. He turned his head toward Marcus, the movement slower, more deliberate. "You should not have come back," he said, but the statement lacked conviction. Marcus's response came just as calm. That would not have changed what needed to be done. Edward's gaze held on him, searching for something, perhaps a trace of resentment, frustration, anything that would make this easier to categorize. But there was none, only quiet certainty, and that unsettled him more than anger ever could. Outside, the rain began to ease, the steady rhythm softening as distant traffic sounds returned, the world slowly resuming its pace. Edward inhaled deeply, then exhaled, his shoulders lowering further, the tension continuing to drain in small, almost unnoticed increments. "I made a mistake," he said finally, the words landing heavier than any command he had ever given. Marcus did not react to it, not outwardly, his expression unchanged, as if the statement belonged entirely to Edward and required no acknowledgement. Edward glanced down briefly, then back up. "Not just tonight," he added, quieter now, more honest. The realization settling in layers, each one harder to ignore than the last. Marcus shifted slightly, pulling back just enough to give space, but not leaving. Not yet. The rain had nearly stopped now, leaving behind a faint mist that clung to the glass. The city lights clearer again, sharper. Edward followed that clarity with his eyes, then returned to Marcus, something unspoken passing between them, something that did not need definition. And for the first time, Edward Callahan understood that control had never been the same as understanding, and that difference had nearly cost him everything. The car remained still at the side of the road, engine idling softly, as the last drops of rain traced slow lines down the windshield. The storm passing, but leaving behind a quiet that felt heavier than the noise before it. Marcus Reed stepped back fully now, closing the door with controlled care, the soft click sealing the space between them again, but not in the same way as before, not as separation, but as a pause. Edward Callahan watched through the glass, his reflection faintly layered over Marcus's figure, the distinction between inside and outside no longer as clear as it had been minutes ago. His hand rested lightly over his chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath, not perfect, not strong, but present, and that was enough. He inhaled slowly, testing the air, the space, the silence. Everything felt different, Not because the world had changed, but because he had seen something he could not unsee. Marcus turned slightly, as if preparing to leave again, his posture returning to that quiet, self-contained stillness that had always defined him. No expectation, no hesitation, just movement forward. Edward's voice broke the silence before the distance could grow. Marcus. It was the first time he had said his name like that, not as a label, not as a role, but as recognition. Marcus paused, not turning immediately, giving the moment space to settle. Edward shifted in his seat, his hand moving away from his chest, resting now against the steering wheel without gripping. I cannot drive like this, he admitted, the words coming slower, measured, but real. Marcus turned back then, his gaze steady, assessing, not questioning, just understanding. Edward exhaled lightly. And I should not be alone. The statement followed, quieter, more honest. Marcus nodded once, a small movement, but enough. He stepped forward again, this time not as someone returning unexpectedly, but as someone who belonged in the moment. He moved around the front of the car, each step deliberate, the faint sound of water beneath his boots the only interruption to the quiet. Edward watched him approach, the familiarity of the motion grounding him in a way he had never noticed before. Marcus opened the driver's side door, pausing briefly as if waiting for confirmation that was no longer necessary. Edward shifted to the passenger seat without protest, the movement slow but controlled, a silent acknowledgement of something far deeper than the exchange itself. The door closed again, the interior settling into a calm that felt earned, not assumed. Marcus adjusted the seat slightly, his hands resting lightly on the wheel, not gripping, just holding. The engine responded to the subtle pressure, a low, steady hum replacing the earlier tension. Neither of them spoke as the car eased back onto the road, the city lights clearer now, reflecting across the damp pavement in long, quiet lines. Edward leaned back into the seat, his breathing even, his gaze forward, but his mind moving through everything that had just unfolded, every moment he had dismissed, every signal he had ignored, and every choice that had led him here. Besides someone he had underestimated, the silence between them was no longer empty. It carried weight, understanding, and something unspoken that did not need to be defined yet. Marcus drove with the same precision as always, smooth, controlled, aware, but there was a difference now, subtle but undeniable, not in his actions, but in the way they were seen. And for the first time, Edward Callahan did not see a driver guiding the car. He saw the man who had guided him back from the edge of something he could not control. The road stretched ahead, open and steady, and inside the car, everything had changed without a single word needing to explain it. The car moved steadily through the city, tires gliding over rain-darkened asphalt, the rhythm of motion now smooth and controlled, matching the steady pulse that filled the quiet interior. Edward Callahan sat back in the passenger seat, his hands resting loosely in his lap, no longer reaching for control, no longer adjusting what could not be forced, his breathing even, but his mind anything but still. He watched the reflections pass across the windshield, streaks of light bending and reforming, and for the first time in years, he noticed how little of it he had actually seen before. Everything had always been filtered through urgency, through decisions, through outcomes, but now there was space, and in that space, clarity began to form. "Pull over at the next light," he said quietly, not as a command, but as a request. Marcus Reed glanced briefly at him, then nodded once. No hesitation, no question. The car slowed smoothly, turning into a quiet side street lined with dim streetlights and empty sidewalks. The engine idled as Marcus brought the car to a stop, the soft hum settling into the silence again. Neither man spoke immediately, the moment stretching just long enough to carry weight. Without tension, Edward leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the faint glow of the dashboard. "I built everything on control," he said, his voice low, measured, but unguarded in a way it had never been before. Marcus remained still, listening, not interrupting, not filling the silence, just present. Edward continued. "Every decision, every risk, every outcome, calculated, predictable, contained." He exhaled slowly, shaking his head once, the movement small, but significant, and none of it mattered back there. The admission hung in the air, quiet but undeniable. Marcus's hands rested lightly on the wheel, his posture unchanged, but his attention focused. Control works until it meets something it cannot predict, he said calmly, not as correction, but as observation. Edward let out a breath that almost resembled a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it, only realization. And I ignored the one thing that was not predictable, he said, turning his head slightly toward Marcus. You. The word landed differently now, not dismissive, not distant, but direct. Marcus met his gaze briefly, then looked forward again, not avoiding, just steady. Edward straightened slightly, his shoulders settling into a position that felt less rigid, less guarded. You saw what I did not, he continued. You understood what I refused to acknowledge. The silence that followed was not empty. It carried the weight of recognition. Marcus spoke after a moment, his tone unchanged, grounded. I just paid attention. Simple, clear, without emphasis. Edward shook his head lightly. No, he said. Quieter now. You chose to. And that difference settled deeper than anything else. Outside, a faint breeze moved through the street, shifting the last traces of rain from the pavement. The city quieter here, removed from the rush. Edward leaned back again, his gaze lifting toward the windshield, but his focus inward. I thought replacing people made things efficient, he said slowly, each word deliberate. But I was wrong. He paused, then added, some people are not replaceable. Marcus did not respond to that directly, his hands remaining steady on the wheel. But the silence that followed acknowledged it fully. Edward turned his head once more, looking at Marcus with a clarity that had not been there before. And I almost lost the only one who mattered tonight. The words were not loud, not dramatic, but they carried truth, unfiltered and complete. The engine continued its low hum. The city waited beyond the glass, and inside the car, the balance of power had shifted in a way that could not be undone, not by authority, not by habit, but only by understanding. And for the first time, Edward Callahan was beginning to see exactly what that required. The engine idled softly as the quiet street held its breath, and Edward Callahan sat there for a moment longer, his gaze lowered, as if weighing something that could not be measured in numbers or decisions. Then he reached forward slowly, his hand resting briefly on the dashboard before pulling back, a small, uncertain movement that did not belong to the man he had been. Marcus, he said again. But this time the name carried something steadier, something resolved. Marcus turned his head. Slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge, his posture unchanged, calm, grounded. Edward inhaled deeply, the air filling his lungs without resistance now. And when he spoke again, there was no hesitation left. I was wrong. The words were simple, but they did not come easily. They settled into the space between them with weight, not as an apology shaped by expectation, but as truth spoken without defense. Marcus remained still for a second, letting the words exist without interruption, without reaction. Then he nodded once. A quiet acceptance, not approval, not dismissal, just recognition. Edward continued, his voice lower now, more measured. I thought I understood value. I thought I knew how to measure it, but I did not see you. He paused, the admission tightening slightly in his chest, not physically, but emotionally. Not really. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was necessary. Marcus's eyes shifted briefly toward him, then forward again, his voice calm when he spoke. You saw what you expected to see. There was no accusation in it, only clarity. Edward let out a breath that felt heavier than the ones before. And I almost paid for that with something I cannot replace, he said, his gaze drifting toward his hands, then back up, steadying. My life. The word lingered in the quiet car, not dramatic, just real. Marcus's grip on the wheel remained light, his posture unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the way he listened, more present, more engaged. Edward straightened slightly, the decision forming as he spoke. I do not want to make that mistake again, he said, turning more fully toward Marcus now, his expression clear, stripped of the distance that once defined it. Not with you. The statement was direct, but not forceful. It carried intent, not authority. Marcus met his gaze for a moment longer this time, searching not for meaning, but for sincerity, and finding it. He nodded once more, slower, more deliberate. Edward continued. If you are willing, I would like you to stay. He paused, choosing his next words carefully, not out of control, but out of respect, not just as my driver. The distinction was important, and he knew it, but as someone I trust. The sentence settled into the space between them, not as an offer of position, but as recognition of value that had always been there. Marcus did not answer immediately, the silence stretching again, but this time it carried thought, consideration. His eyes lowered briefly, then returned forward. His voice when it came was steady, unchanged in tone, but different in weight. Trust is not something you assign, he said quietly. It is something you build. Edward nodded slowly, accepting that without resistance, without argument. Then I will build it, he replied, the certainty in his voice not sharp, not commanding, but grounded, real. Outside, the streetlights flickered faintly as the last of the rain faded into the night, the city beginning to breathe again. And inside the car, something new had taken shape, not defined, not complete, but undeniable. Marcus shifted his hands slightly on the wheel, preparing to move, and Edward leaned back into the seat, not as someone in control, but as someone who had finally understood what control had cost him and what it would take to change. The car eased back onto the main road, its movement smooth and unhurried, as if there was no longer anything to chase or outrun, just a direction to follow. The city stretched ahead in quiet lines of light, reflections shimmering across damp pavement like something newly revealed. Marcus Reed drove with the same steady precision, his hands relaxed on the wheel, his focus forward, grounded in the present. While beside him, Edward Callahan sat in stillness, not the rigid kind he had carried before, but something softer, something that allowed space for thought, for change, for truth to settle where it had been ignored. The steady pulse of the device continued beneath his shirt, consistent now, reliable, but no longer taken for granted. His hand rested lightly over it, not in control, but in acknowledgement, a quiet connection to the moment that had shifted everything. They passed through an intersection where the traffic light changed from red to green, the glow washing briefly across their faces, illuminating them both in equal measure. And for a second, Edward noticed it, the reflection, not of status or role, but of presence, of two men sharing the same space, the same silence, the same path forward. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, intentional, and let his hand fall back to his lap. Outside, the rain had fully stopped now, leaving the air clearer, sharper, the city alive again but no longer overwhelming, just existing. Marcus adjusted the wheel slightly as they merged onto a wider road, the hum of the engine blending with the distant sounds of the night. Nothing rushed, nothing forced, just movement. Edward turned his head slightly, his gaze resting on Marcus for a brief moment, not studying, not questioning, just seeing. And then he looked forward again, the weight of everything that had been said no longer pressing, but settling into something quieter, something lasting. No words followed, none were needed. The offer had been made, the truth had been acknowledged, and what remained was not resolution, but continuation, the kind that did not